I'm Dometi Pongo, and over the past few weeks, we've been drawing parallels between significant moments in history and what we see happening today. We've talked about music, media, movements, and today we're going to talk about memory, the importance of preserving our history. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak to one of our country's leading historians. I'm in conversation with Lonnie Bunch, the first African-American secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African-American History and Culture. Secretary Bunch, as I think about memory, there's a Adinkra symbol in West Africa called Sankofa. That's, look back to see where you're going. And I think that what has been the greatest tragedy, I believe, of America's enslavement of Africans has been the loss of that history. And that Black Americans don't have a way to touch and to hold some of that history. How has that lack of ancestral memory permeated other sectors of the Black experience?
My whole career has been about remembering. So for me, memory is one of the most important things. And some of that memory is really just rethinking our own experiences. One of the things that really struck me when I was creating the African American Museum is, as I was doing surveys around the country, the number of African Americans who were embarrassed by their slave ancestors. I was walking down the street one day and this old church lady came to me and said, "I know who you are, can I hug you?" Well, this was before the pandemic, so she hugged me. And then as she whispered, she said, "You're doing good work, but don't talk about slavery." And so part of what I wanted was to craft an opportunity for people to understand that, one, slavery shapes all Americans, and two, that I want Black Americans to know that rather than be embarrassed, wish that we were all as strong as our enslaved ancestors. So part of what memory is giving people a clearer sense of who we are. And more importantly, what memory is really about, redefining America's identity. Redefining America so it has a truer sense of its history, and that by having that truer sense, it'll give us the tools to live the life we're in today.
Can we unpack that a little bit more about the anger at the representation of ourselves as slaves? I remember when 12 Years a Slave came out, and I had so many friends that were like, "I'm tired of seeing myself as a slave. I'm tired of seeing myself subjugated. We should be done with these movies." And I remember telling them at the time I had, my nieces had just been born, and I'm like, "Yo, my nieces probably won't watch Roots. There needs to be a couple of those movies for their generation to update us on that." But the counter argument, once again, is sometimes that's all we see. All we see is us in a position of pain. How do we reconcile that as we try to remember that painful history but not be, stilted in it?
Some of the earlier works show us as people defined solely by enslavement, show us as people who are broken by it. What 12 Years a Slave does is really, first of all, does something that is so important. It humanizes slavery by telling it through the lens of one person. That, to me, is an example of how we need these stories, because as a historian, there are so many stories that we've never talked about. So many stories that could really shape and help us rethink who we are. But I think it's also crucial to say that part of the challenge is, if most people get their history through television and film, then we've got to make sure that we have a more active, a more bountiful sense of that history so people can see the complexity of it rather than see it through one lens.
And I think we don't talk enough about the history of slave rebellions, which we see a lot at the Smithsonian Museum. Can you talk more about the number of revolts and rebellions that we've seen, the long history of resistance?
Let's look at it this way. There's a great quotation from an enslaved person who said once, every time we'd come back from the field, the number one conversation in the cabins were about freedom. So in other words, nobody ever accepted that they were enslaved. And so what you see is rebellions on several levels. One level is just running away, just risking the torture from the dogs that chased you to basically say, enough is enough, I'm not going to take that. Another form of rebellion, you actually see people like Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner and others whose names we don't know, who basically said, this is our opportunity to strike for freedom. That meant it was a violent strike, but that it meant that freedom was in the heart of these people. Whether many slave owners said they were happy and content, but these rebellions tell us that's wrong, that they really wanted freedom. And then those that stayed on the plantation sometimes rebelled in small ways, breaking tools, injuring animals, so therefore you had a day off. So the key is to find those victories, whether it is striking for freedom, running away for freedom, or doing something that slows the work up. Those are the ways you fight a system, and those are the ways that African Americans found ways to make a way out of no way.
What are some of the artifacts at the National Museum that give us a window into some of those stories?
Slavery is about confinement. So you see a cabin where the enslaved lived. There's a cabin that was from Edisto Island in South Carolina. And when it was used by the enslaved, it had one door because the overseer wanted to see you come in and out one door. As soon as freedom came, as soon as they became free, the first thing they did was make a second door so they could go out whenever they wanted. Now that may sound really small, but think about it. You've lived your whole life enslaved. What are the things you say immediately that say, I am my own person? Making a door is a major statement of freedom.
Even back home, I take trips to Ghana very frequently. I take groups of Black Americans there with me. And there's part of the ritual when you go to Cape Coast or Elmina, the slave dungeons, there's a door that used to be called the Door of No Return. And when you get to the other side of it, in modern day, they put up a plaque just above it that says the Door of Return, because never in their wildest dreams did they imagine that Black folks would be able to go from one side of that door and back through it, back to freedom, as we look at this history. So it's very symbolic and at the same time very tangible. But something that's complex about memory is that not only do we have these artifacts that remind us of, Black brilliance, but then there are artifacts and monuments that remind us of Black pain and Black subjugation. A lot has been made about the tearing down of Confederate monuments. And some make the argument that some of them should be left up so that this country can't run away from its racist past. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I'm a firm believer in the pruning of monuments, that history and memory was never meant to be permanent. It should evolve over time. But what I would like to see is more history brought to bear. So as when we think about what monuments we tear down, we understand exactly what we're doing. We know exactly why we're doing them. So I am a firm believer coming out of a culture that has had its history erased. I'd never erase history. But what I want is to tell the unvarnished truth, to have African American history as the great corrective, so that we understand truer who we are, warts and all.
Along a similar note, there have been conversations about renaming the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I've talked to folks who were there on Bloody Sunday, and they say, no, giving that bridge a peaceful name is to erase what we experienced there. We need to know, in that context, to who Edmund Pettus was, so that we know what this space represents. What are the conversations that you've been having around that as well?
To be honest, I am someone who would like to sort of keep the name Edmund Pettus small, but on that big overpass, I'd love to say John Lewis. They call him the voice of conscience in the Congress, but I think he's the voice of conscience in America. And I think that for, more than 50 years, he has not only fought the fight for civil rights, he's fought the fight for fairness across the board. So I would argue a bridge full of pain, a bridge that was ripe with hatred, what better symbol than John Lewis to remind us of the courage it takes to fight that pain, to cross that bridge.
For so many of us, memory has been a matter of life and death. I think about the passing on of the Green Book so that we know where to go. I think about the talk that my dad had with me on prom. I thought I was doing something big. He let me drive a Jaguar to prom that night. And he sat me down and said, listen, you're taking a big risk being so young, driving this nice car. And we had the conversation when I was younger, but not as seriously as we did on my prom night. And it marred my whole evening because I spent the whole night looking over my shoulder. I was nervous, and I didn't feel like I had the same right to space that the other kids in my school had. And when we talk about memory, can you talk a little bit about how memory has been passed down in your family, and how preserving these memories, even the painful ones about the Green Book and about these sundown towns, how endemic that is, how much a part of the fabric of American and Black culture that really is?
And how much a part of our own personal lives these stories are. You know, the Green Book was a book that helped people find where Blacks can stay, where they can eat, and it was ultimately published by what was then S.O. Gas. And when I was a kid, my father would only buy S.O. Gas, right? And I remember one time we were running out of gas. I'm like, I am not going to push this car. And he's like, and I said, there's another gas station. He said, it's not S.O. And for him, S.O. was not only the place that published the Green Book, but as he said, in his youth, in the 30s and 40s, S.O. was the only place that let Black people use the facilities. So to him, this was a way to always thank them because they treated him fairly, and he always used S.O. So for me, now learning that story really helped me understand both my father, but understand a lot about the kind of circumstances they went through. And I think that, you know, I can tell stories to my kids. They're probably bored by now. But I think that the most important thing is to realize that, one, by passing on these memories, what you're doing is helping people understand you better, but really helping them understand themselves, to see the kinds of struggles and fears and moments that were transformative for an earlier generation. And it should inspire the current generation to look for their own transformative moments by remembering the pain, the joy, but more importantly, they allow us to know who we are for generations yet to be.
That was beautiful. Secretary, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
My pleasure. It was great to hang out with you guys, and, you know, we should cause some trouble together sometime when this thing eases.
I hope so.
All right.
All right.